At the time, I was still a child. At 18, I hadn't the time or the experience to handle the situation I found myself in that night. Looking back, this whole story sounds so stupid now. But I'll tell it anyway. It was 1987. I had just moved from my parents' loving home in Cleveland into a rented flat on the outskirts of New York. It had been a logistical nightmare with issues from the beginning. But being a stubborn teenage girl, I invariably thought I knew best. At that time, I envisioned myself as a career woman. I wanted to work in business and wear fancy suits and expensive heels. I wanted my own desk with a plaque. So of course, NY was the place to be. I had managed to wrangle an internship in HR at a local business center through a friend of a friend. The minute I was accepted, I began searching for my own apartment. It took some digging before I found one cheap enough for a young intern. It was an old apartment, room 203. The instant I opened the door on that first September evening, I could smell the mildew from the leaking shower, the dust that had collected between the slats and the floorboards, and that acrid, musty scent that haunts all houses left uninhabited for any significant amount of time. I wasn't expecting the Ritz, but I thought someone might have at least cleaned the place up before attempting to let it out again. I was disheartened, to say the least. After the long journey, I'd hoped seeing my new abode would brighten my spirits. It didn't. I always thought myself well-educated and at least somewhat savvy. But no. I'd fallen victim to a sleazy realtor with a good eye for angles and an overpriced fisheye lens. I remember dropping my bags by the couch and crying into the only pillow I'd brought with me. It still smelled like home. I knew it wouldn't last, but I tried so desperately to revive every last drop of my mother's perfume from that pillowcase. She probably thought I would be having a wonderful time in the big city. If only she knew how low and lonely I felt in that moment. I must have cried myself to sleep, because the next morning I woke up on the sofa, sun streaming straight into my bloodshot eyes. It was a Saturday. I remember because I'd only given myself 2 days to settle in before work in the Big Apple. What had previously sounded like an adventure now struck me with anxiety. I just wanted to go home. I spent that first day cleaning. I vacuumed, mopped, dusted, polished, and bleached the shit out of that place. I took down the curtains and threw them in the washer along with the couch covers. By midday, I'd managed to raise my spirits at least a little, although that may have just been the fumes from the Clorox. When evening rolled round, I'd begun to unpack my life onto the floorboards of my new room. I gulped back thick tears as I placed my mother's photo at my bedside. And I told myself I would ring her tomorrow when I found the nearest phone box, and then everything would be okay. To settle my nerves, I remember I made some cocoa. The kind Mum always made when we were sad. The kind with tiny marshmallows and chocolate sprinkles. I got changed into a nightshirt, took off my bra, and let my hair down before heading to my tiny kitchenette. I stood listening to the kettle boil in a sort of trance. Standing barefoot on the tiles, I realized how bitterly cold the apartment was going to be come winter. Once I'd made a second hot chocolate, this time using hot milk, the way Mum actually makes it, it was dark outside. I shuffled back to my new bedroom, laid the mug on my dresser, and threw on my bedside lamp. A soft glow filled my room. A small but pertinent reminder of home. Grabbing my book from my handbag, I traversed the laminate to close the curtains. and sighing, I peered through the grimy window. My room faced onto another apartment block. Concrete after concrete after concrete. Bricks and iron stepladders. A garbage chute. The moon cast its pale light at strange angles, causing me to adjust my eyes to see properly. I could make out trash bags on the sidewalk that looked remarkably like a body bag might in the pale moonlight. I chastised myself for thinking that way. I had a habit of freaking myself out when I was alone. I was just about to pull the curtains when I saw him. Only for a second, but it was enough to stop me dead in my tracks. A bolt of fear ran straight through my legs, anchoring me in place. My blood ran cold. My breathing stopped. He had been right there. I could still see him in the periphery of my mind, the way his limbs had moved so grotesquely out of sight. After taking a minute to settle myself, I pulled the curtains to and got into bed, shivering. My hands felt numb as I sipped at my hot cocoa, not really noticing the way it burned my lips. I tried to shake his image from my head and tell myself it was all in my head, but I knew what I saw. He was there, watching me. I slouched further into my covers, eventually pulling the sheets over my head for comfort, and I remained there the whole night. A few days passed. I began my job, met some new friends, and found myself settling into the new apartment. I called my mother to tell her I was okay, and that I'd managed to feed myself without burning the flat to a crisp. I became accustomed to the hustle and bustle of life in the city. I scouted out the cheapest grocery store and the best coffee house, and I found a wonderful bookstore just off 5th, which I began to spend my lunch breaks in. Things were beginning to look up. I had all but forgotten about him. I arrived home late one morning in December. It was about 4 a.m. when I staggered into my apartment after a Christmas party with work. I'd spent the night with James, an accountant from the floor above, and I had drank far too much in an attempt to impress him. As it turned out, I achieved quite the opposite, and he, still sober and sick of my shit, decided to drop me off at my flat. I still don't know how I made it up the stairs wearing only one of my heels, and a blinding amount of shame. After fumbling with my keys for what seemed like half an hour, I managed to stumble into my apartment and head first onto my bed, where I remained, comatose, until the following evening. When I woke, my head was pounding, and my tongue felt like sandpaper in my mouth. At 18, I wasn't yet used to drinking. Groggy as hell, I forced my eyes open. It took a few seconds to orient myself. The room spun mockingly, my eyes focusing and unfocusing in a drunken haze. A beam of light smacked me dead in the eyes. I was on my bed, facing the window. Fighting the urge to fall back asleep, I lifted my body from the bed to close the curtains. Cradling my head in my hands, I noticed my bloodied knees and ripped tights. Whatever I had done the night previously, I did not want to know. I peeled the stockings from my legs, wincing as they pulled with them the beginnings of a fresh scab. I stripped the rest of my elixir-soaked clothing from my body, throwing them in a heap by my bed. Standing in only my underwear, I pried a stray eyelash from my cheek and dropped it to my dressing table before the mirror. I was a mess. Lipstick was smeared across my face into an eerie Chelsea smile. Mascara still clung to my left eye amid strands of claggy eyelash glue. My right was completely devoid of makeup altogether from where I'd pressed my face into the bed. Laughing to myself in disdain, I turned to close the curtains and head to bed. He was there, pressed up against the window. He'd been watching me the entire time. He'd watched me undress and continued to watch me as I stood, frozen in horror. I reeled backwards, losing my balance and falling to the floor. I couldn't even scream. He didn't flinch. The way his limbs touched the glass sickened me to my core. I couldn't tear my eyes from him as I scrambled backwards into the kitchen, slamming the door behind me. And there I sat, alone, barely clothed, naked skin against the cold tiles, weeping quietly against the door. My breathing came in sharp spurts between sobs. He'd found me again. I didn't tell anyone about that night. In a way, it seemed like a dream, except the bruises on my leg where it caught it on the door jamb in my haste contemptuously remind me otherwise. For weeks straight, I slept on the couch. The months went by, and for a long time I kept the curtains shut. I couldn't bring myself to open them again for fear that he would be there, centimeters away from me, with only that thin pane of glass between us. To the people in the opposite apartment, it must have looked as though I had died. It was only once winter had passed and the nights grew brighter that I began to open them again. The summer of '88 was sweltering. AC blazed in every store, taxi, and coffee house in New York. Weather warnings were issued on the news most days, reminding us to drink plenty of water and stay inside where possible. It was unlike anything I had ever known. And eventually, I had to drop my anxieties for fear of cooking to death in my own apartment. So I opened my windows. Saturday, July 12th, was a warm night. Somehow warmer than all the others combined. My windows were open as wide as they would go, and my little bedside fan blew tepid air into my face as I slept. I had one blanket, more for comfort than for warmth at this point, to cover my naked body as I sprawled out across my double mattress. My sleep was restless. I awoke many times that night, caked in sweat and desperate for a glass of cool water. No amount of liquid could slake my throat, it seemed. Turning on my bedside lamp, I wiped the dried saliva from my cheek and tied up my hair with a clip. I then made my way to the kitchen. Even the tiles felt warm. It was hotter than I had ever known. I grabbed a pint glass from the cupboard and filled it twice with cold water. Gulping down what must have been my 10th glass of the evening, I returned, sleepily, to my room. My heart slammed against my ribcage, and hot blood seared my throat. He was there. But he was not at the window. No. No, this time he was inside. In my room. Waiting. He hadn't even tried to hide himself. I dropped my glass and I felt it shatter at my feet. Shards ripped at my skin, but somehow I felt nothing. I was completely numb. Blood pounded in my ears. My tongue felt too big for my mouth. I panicked. I couldn't tell if he was watching me or not, but I couldn't take any chances. Summoning every ounce of strength I could muster, I pulled the bedside lamp from its socket and hurled it directly at his head. Tears streamed down my face as I let out a scream of anger and despair. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't continue to live in fear. I watched it hit. I saw him fall to the ground, silent. My lamp lay in pieces around his naked body. There was no blood, no screaming, not even the rattle of a final breath. For a time, there was only the sound of my breathing and the swish of the curtains in the breeze. It was too calm, too quiet. I must have sat for at least an hour, staring at his lifeless body, unable to move. He was dead. There was no doubt about it. And I had killed him. I kept telling myself over and over that he shouldn't have been there, that I had every right to defend myself. But staring at his stiffening corpse on the floor, I couldn't shake that sickening sense of guilt. When the light finally came through the gap in the curtains, I managed to move. I stepped cautiously over his body, certain he would wake even though it had been hours. He didn't. In the bathroom, I put on my robes and splashed my face with cold water. Then I knew I would have to dispose of the corpse. I had spent a significant portion of the night wondering how to do so without touching him. Oh, the thought of touching him at all made my skin crawl. But in the end, I had only one option. I entered my bedroom, wearing latex gloves and holding a single tissue. I tried not to look as I bent down beside his body. I didn't want to see his eyes. As quickly as I could, I scooped him up into my hand and ran back to the bathroom, dropping his tiny corpse in the toilet. His 8 tiny legs folded into themselves, enveloping his body in a swaddle of arachnoid limbs. Ugh. Tears streamed down my face, one flush of the toilet, and he was gone. Forever. And I was free. I was finally fucking free.